saw 3 crosses, and at that moment he felt that he was secure, and he didn't care what happened after that. They eventually let him go. After 3.5 years of imprisonment and torture, they sent him home because he got meningitis in prison, and they had nothing to do to cure him, so they sent him home to die. As he got home, there was a need for a well, and while he was sick as that, he decided the last thing to do in life was to dig a well. And as he began digging the well, by the time he got down to the bottom, he had perspired so much that by the time he hit the bottom, he was cured of meningitis. And he got back out and he was able to live. But he determined that there is no way that he's going to live in that type of environment for the rest of his life. And he heard about the American dream in his mind. And he determined to move to the United States. And in that process, it was very difficult to immigrate to the United States. It was not just an easy thing to pack up and move. But back in those days, they had this thing called a immigration lottery. I understand they still have some of it today. And he applied to the United States to immigrate to America. He then later on got married. My brother and I were born in Yugoslavia. And after some period of time, when I was 2 years old, he got notification that he had won the lottery. And he is now going to go to the United States. So we closed up everything. At that point, we were living in Croatia. And we went down to the port. We loaded up our things on a boat. And we headed for the United States of America. And crossing that ocean, first going through the Mediterranean Sea, eventually going through the Straits of Gibraltar, stopping in Portugal, in Lisbon, and finally across to New York. Now, while my father was on board this ship, he noticed one of the officers on that ship was his chief persecutor. During those 3.5 years, there was a man on board that ship who had done the most to persecute him. And so my father decided to lie low. He kind of remained just kind of down there, just stayed out of everybody's way. And then as the ship entered the United States waters, the protectorate of the United States, the ship, what they did at that point is on the flag mast, they raised up the American flag. And when my father saw the American flag, he then felt free. Now I am in America. I'm under that protection. And he went to the man and he said, "Do you remember me?" The man got terrified. He turned white. You know, he thought, my dad now is going to have revenge. And so they kind of stayed out of each other's way. And as soon as we landed in New York City, that guy took off the ship as quick as he possibly could to make sure my dad does not find him. And from New York City, we then traveled 3.5 days by bus all the way to Sacramento, California. That was back in 1962. Entering America, you know, America meant a lot to a lot of people around the world over the centuries. And with all the difficulties, and America has had its problems, and, you know, I travel different parts of the world, I go through different places, and some places they're eager to see America fall. I remember in 2008, I was visiting Spain, and some people told me America needs to get on its knees. They need to suffer like all the other places. It needs to suffer. And, you know, right about that time is when we hit that global financial crisis. America got hit hard. It really rocked America, but the people in Spain got so bad they're still suffering. Okay, they were so interdependent with the American economy that they began to suffer as well. And so America still is a very good place to live. The question that we have this evening is, does the Bible say anything about America? Because America has had quite an influential role in the last few years, especially, actually, even without realizing it, America has had an important role since its inception. Right from its inception, it has had an important role. Now, unfortunately, our seminar is very short. And being short, we had to skip certain topics. For example, Daniel 7, we could not study Daniel 7 and spend the justifiable time there. And even Revelation 13 to deal with the first beast. So what I'm going to do is something I don't like doing. What I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that you understand these subjects. And if you don't, we do have several workers that would be more than happy to come and visit you and cover some of these prophecies. But just a few things that we do want to mention. When we talk about a beast in Bible prophecy, so there's beasts in Daniel, there's beasts in Revelation. Whenever you see a beast, it has a meaning. In Daniel chapter 7 and verse 23, it says, "And thus he said, the fourth beast shall be the fourth what? Fourth kingdom." So the fourth beast is the fourth kingdom, therefore the third beast is the third kingdom. Second beast, first beast, these are kingdoms. And you find these in Daniel chapter 7. So as you look at Daniel 7, there are different beasts there, and they are symbolic of kingdoms. Sometimes these are civil or political powers, and sometimes they are combined with some kind of a religious structure that has its control over it. In Revelation 13, 1 to 10, we have a beast that overall looks like a leopard. That's what it looks like. When you first look at it, it looks like a leopard. Obviously, there are several things about it to be able to make it appear like the nation that it represents. In Revelation 13 and verse 2, it says, "And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were the feet of a bear, and his mouth is the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, his seat, and great authority." So this beast here, if you take a look, it overall looks like a leopard, but the mouth is the mouth of a lion. So this is not a leopard's face. This is a face of a lion. The feet were not a feet of a lion nor a leopard. The feet were that of a bear. And it has 7 heads. This is what this beast looks like. And keep in mind, beasts are symbolic of nations, of kingdoms. So therefore, here is a kingdom that has these characteristics. Now in Daniel chapter 7, we identified these same kingdoms. Because in Daniel 7, you first have a lion, then you have a bear, then you have a leopard, and then you have a dragon. These are the kingdoms mentioned in Daniel chapter 7. So here are those kingdoms, and they each had certain characteristics that each of these nations had. Since the leopard was the first one, the leopard actually in Daniel 7 was the symbol of Greece. And when you look at Greece, Greece has certain characteristics. Among the things that Greece introduced to the nations of that time that was quite unique. Up to that time, you always had nations since the time of Babylon. The Tower of Babel was first built in the time of Nimrod in the early part of the book of Genesis. You've always had different nations. Some of them they had religious systems, and a lot of their religious systems were crude religious systems. And last year I went to India. That was my first time in India. And when I was there in India, what really I noticed, first of all, was their crude worship of images and idolatry. It was very open, and I went to one of the temples, and I was looking at what people are worshiping, and it's like, wow, this doesn't make sense. to a human mind. And a lot of nations were doing that up to that time. But Greece was unique. Greece introduced, even though they still worshiped images and things like that, but they introduced a system of philosophy, intellectual philosophy, so that it removed the crudeness out of it and made it something appealing. That's what they did with all this type of thing. So the main characteristic of Greece was its educational system and its philosophy. And today it has influenced the world. You look at a lot of the universities, their direct influence is Grecian influence all the way up until today. Now the bear was the Medo-Persians, and in Daniel 7 the bear was introduced with 3 ribs in its mouth. Now a bear is not usually like that, you see. Now when you see an animal with a rib in its mouth, I mean, what animal do you normally see with a rib in its mouth? Or some kind of a bone in its mouth? What kind of an animal? A dog. A dog has an animal. A dog goes out there, he has a bone. He's happy to have a bone. And when a dog has a bone, how does he act? What happens when you come close to a dog with a bone in it? Okay, he starts letting you know that he's a vicious animal. And so when you take a bear normally doesn't go around with a bone in its mouth. But this shows its viciousness, and you find its viciousness in a characteristic of it as a nation. It also had unique laws. The laws of the Medes and the Persians were laws that don't change. Once they make a law, they can't change the law. You remember the story of Daniel and the lion's den. The king spent all night after he passed the law. He made a law, and he couldn't change his own law. And Daniel had to spend the night in the lion's den. So that was the characteristic of the bear in Medo-Persia. And in this Revelation 13, it's the feet are the feet of a bear. The lion's mouth, well, there are 2 things that you have with a lion. Babylon was known for its wealth. If you remember on our first evening, they mentioned that the wealth of Babylon was so great that even many years later, they're still carrying things out of Babylon. That's how much wealth it had. So it was very wealthy. And also, it says, because it's a mouth, what do you do with your mouth? You speak. Okay, that's the main thing we do. We eat also, but not as much as we speak. We tend to speak more than we eat, you see. And so it's something that comes out of the mouth of Babylon. And the last one was the dragon, and the dragon was the Roman power, and it gave its seat and great authority. And the seat is the capital, which was of Rome, and the authority was given to this beast by the Roman power. And again, we don't have time to go through this, but from our study of church history comparing with Bible prophecy, we find that this is the civil and religious power vested in the Roman Catholic Church. We need to understand that Roman Catholicism is not just a religion. When you look at the Pope in Rome, he is not just a religious leader. He is also a civil leader. And this is why, just a couple years ago, I was visiting London, and the people in England were very irate. They were going through a financial crisis. They were cutting down services, and the Pope was coming there for a visit. And as he was coming there for a visit, they were spending millions of pounds to protect the Pope when he enters the country and doing all these things. And the people were complaining, why are we spending that kind of money, our hard-earned money, for a religious leader? And I was just waiting to hear what they would say, and the answer was correct, that this is not just a religious leader, he is a civil leader. The Vatican City is a country, and it is treated as he goes around the world as a religious leader as well. And the power, if you remember, we touched on this the other day, was for 42 months. We touched on that last week. The 42 months are 1,260 days or years of prophecy. And this began in 538 to 1798. Again, we're not going to spend our time here because we want to talk about the United States. So we find 42 months times 30 is 1260. And if you go from 538 plus 1260, you get to the year 1798. At the end of the 1260 years, 1798, the Pope was taken prisoner by the French General Berthier, and the following year, on August 29th, 1799, he died in exile. And of course, at that point, he received a deadly wound. Revelation 13:3 talks about a deadly wound that he received, but later on the deadly wound is to be healed. So even though it was deadly, it somehow manages to come back to life. And we're not going to go through all that detail, like I said, right now. That's room for another study. However, this was important to bring us because it received that wound in 1798. It lost its power, and it never had regained that power until the late 1800s. I think it was 1856 in Garibaldi's revolution in Italy that the Vatican once again became a nation once more. And actually Cardinal Gaspari, 1850s in the revolution, they took away even the land. But it was under Mussolini, when he was the leader of Italy, that they were able to sign the Concordat, in which it made it a nation once more. But the downfall began in the 1798. Now we come to verse 11, and here we're going to spend a little bit more time now. In verse 11 says, I beheld. Now, verse 10 was the deadly wound, which brings us to the year 1798. And verse 11, and I beheld another what? Another beast. What does that mean? Another nation, another kingdom. Another kingdom coming up out of the earth. And he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. Now let's think about this verse here. First of all, again, it introduced the year 1798, and it says another beast was what? Was coming up. What does coming up mean? If it's coming up, it is now what? It is in the process of getting up. So if I'm sitting down, you see, and I'm getting up or coming up, I'm coming up, you see. So it means, it does not mean that it is a nation of long existence. And it doesn't mean it's not a nation. It means that it's just coming up. It is a young nation, and it's coming up out of the earth. Now, and again, verse 10 showed that would have been in 1798. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. Again, I just mentioned that was 1798. So, John Wesley, actually, as he was writing about this in the year 1760, John Wesley, speaking about this nation, he says, he is not yet come, though he cannot be far off, for he is to appear at the end of the 42 months of the first beast. So he is to appear at the end of those 42 months, which end in 1798. So in 1798, he is to come upon the scene of action. And it says here, he is coming up like a lamb, right? So it's a lamb-like beast. It shows it is youthful. Now, what do you think of a lamb? So again, just going back here, two horns like a lamb. So not only the whole thing appears as a lamb. Now, when you look at the lamb, how does the lamb react? In Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7, this is a prophecy about Jesus, and it identifies certain lamb-like characteristics. It says, he was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter. And as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. So what does this tell us? The lamb-like characteristics are very peaceful. Even brought to the slaughter, the lamb is more peaceful. my neighbor used to have lambs and pigs. And when they're ready to slaughter the pig, you hear it from all the way down the street. That pig is running. He knows what's happening. He's running for life. They got to try to catch him and everything else. And the lamb just goes. That's it. It is over with. So you find that these are the characteristics of a lamb. A very peaceful type of an animal. More trusting. A lamb is more trusting, not thinking of evil. In Jeremiah 11, verse 19, as it talks about the lamb, it says, "But I was like a lamb or an ox that is brought to the slaughter, and I knew not that they had devised devices against me." So he was not contemplating what people are planning and what kind of deceit they're trying to do. Now, going back to verse 11, this other beast is coming up out of what? Out of the earth. Now, when you look at some of the other prophecies, most of those beasts are coming up out of water or sea. You find that in Daniel 7, Revelation 13. Other places you find it coming up out of the sea. And sea has symbolism, or water has a symbolism. In Revelation 17 and verse 15, it says, "And he saith unto me, the waters which thou sawest where the horse sitteth are what? Are peoples, and multitudes, and nations, and tongues." So the waters are symbol of a place that is where the high population centers. And so if the sea is a place of high population center, what would the earth symbolize? Of less population. There's still population, but it's more less populated than that. Now, most nations are created in large population centers. Most nations are created like that. But this one would be quite different. It would be formed in a place that is sparsely populated. So it means, and coming up as a lamb, it means that it does not come through conquering other nations. If you look at the lion, for example, he goes in Daniel 7, he conquers other nations as a lion. A bear does the same thing, even has 3 ribs in his mouth. All these nations have something different, something conquering another nation. And here this nation comes up more lamb-like than anything else. And so we cannot look for this nation to come up in war-torn Europe. Europe was just, it has a high population. It is constantly, it's been under wars ever since you can remember. If you look at Asia, Asia has the kingdoms that had existed for millennia. Long before 1798, they had nations, powerful nations that are in existence. Or Africa, you had strong nations in Africa. You had Egypt, you had Ethiopia, you had some of these strong nations there. The Middle East, same thing. You had nations there for a long existence. And they were populated quite early on in the history of the world. This new nation would have to uproot other people in order to come there, and then that means it would have to come up out of the sea, just like all the rest. There's only one place we can look at, and that is in what we call the New World. And as you look in the New World, in South America, you have the powerful Inca nation. They had existed there at that time, but they were conquered, and they were actually colonies to Spain and Portugal at that time. In 1798, they were not existent, but they were already under another power. And so the same thing happened with the rest of South America. If you look at Central America, places that we call Mexico today, you had the 2 empires, the Mayan and the Aztec empires. But again, both of these great nations were without their power as soon as the Spanish explorers had come there, and that was long before the year 1798, because in 1798 we have to see a nation coming into existence. In North America, there was not a nation, they were scattered tribes. The only thing that came close to a nation was the Cherokee Nation. That was in the eastern part of the United States. There was a year one time in the state of Indiana, it was the Indiana Territory at the time, that there was one of the Indians there that he wanted to unite all the Indian tribes into a powerful nation to resist the onslaught of the people coming from the Americas. And they tried to unite them together. That whole thing fell apart. And they never were a strong nation. And they never had power in the earthly matters or world nation as a world. And they were all swallowed up in what we call Canada and the United States today. Canada, up until recently, was still a Commonwealth country under the European Great Britain. It did finally become separated from it. It's still tied with it to a degree, but it was actually it became a separate country eventually. Even Australia, it's a separate country, but it's still actually under the Queen. So here, technically, you still have the government under the official role of the monarchy. Even recently, when the Prime Minister dissolved the government, he had to get permission from the Governor General to be able to dissolve government. Even though it's a ceremonial role, ceremonially they're still tied to Great Britain. And that leaves us, obviously, the United States and whether it fulfills the condition for these prophecies. So let's take a look just for a few minutes here this evening. Does the United States fit that? The United States was colonized by the British from the 1500s to the 1700s. Part of it was by the British. The French had a large territory in the center as well. And the Spanish also had certain areas, especially around Florida. And the Spanish had also the territories of what we know today as California, all the way into Texas. All that was part of Mexico. And Mexico was under Spain at that time. Now, during this time, the people who later formed the United States, they moved to the vast wilderness of the eastern part of the continent. By 1776, the year that they declared independence from Great Britain, they were in 13 colonies. The population of those 13 colonies was about 3 million people. And it went all the way from Maine, what we know as Maine today, all the way down to Georgia and Florida. In the war that followed, they did not go to conquer the territory. They actually fought off with the British. Now, I'm not speaking here the Indians. The Indians who lived there, they well deserved to keep their land. But they were not a nation as such. We're talking here in a biblical perspective. We're talking about nations. Now, even some of them, they called themselves nations, but they were more nomadic tribes. And this is why they could not stand up to what happened later on to them. And so this nation formed, the principles of this nation were Protestantism and republicanism. These were the two things that were developed in this nation. They had certain convictions, and they grew up in New England a representative form of government. Keep in mind that up to that time, the world was ruled by kings. All of Europe, everywhere was ruled by kings. And here is the first time that they introduced a different form of government. In the towns surrounding Boston, they refused to be taxed unless they had a voice in the legislative body. They eventually called it the Boston Tea Party, in which the British used to send ships. They used to gather tea, and that's when the United States changed from tea drinking to coffee, by the way. They took the tea, they had to stop in a British port just so they can be taxed. And when the ship landed in Boston Harbor, they went out there and they threw all the tea into Boston Harbor. That was called the Boston Tea Party. Thomas Hooker, with his whole congregation, emigrated to Connecticut for greater liberty. And there they, in the year 1633, that is where the first Constitution was actually formed, was in Connecticut. And on the license plates in Connecticut, they still have, it's called the Constitution State, because they were the first ones to have a constitution. Rhode Island, you had, when Rhode Island was formed, it was solely came into existence because of the attempt of oppression on man upon fellow man. You had Roger Williams, he was also up there in Boston, and they were insisting on certain to support the state church, and he refused to support the state church. Finally, in the middle one winter, they kicked him out of Boston. And so he had to go in the snow with his family to go out in the middle of nowhere to survive. But he had, as a missionary, he had befriended the Indians, and they took him in. And they finally gave him a place. And when they arrived to that place, a beautiful harbor, they said, this is, and he bought it from the Indians as opposed to fight for it. He bought that land from them. And he said, in the providence of God, he has brought us here. And they named the city Providence. And that's the capital of Rhode Island. And in Providence, Rhode Island, they established the principles of religious liberty. There was no requirement of religious affiliation in order to go there. And that principle eventually found its way into the Constitution of the United States. In 1787, the colonies gathered together and they adopted a constitution which united the colonies and eventually became in effect on March 14th, 1789. So in 1787, they agreed to the Constitution, and then the different states had ratified it. By the year March 4th, 1789 is when it became effective and the United States was actually born. That was the date of its actual birth, 1789. The government that was established was not a democracy. And a lot of people misunderstand that. The United States was not established as a democracy. The forefathers in America were fearful of a democracy. Democracy actually is a dangerous thing. It's quite dangerous. A pure democracy is basically mob rule. So the majority makes a decision. So if the majority here decide that we need to kill Doug, we vote, the majority decides, we kill Doug. It's quite simple. Sorry, Doug, but that's what a democracy is. The majority decides that. The founding fathers in America were fearful of both the tyrannical government of kings, but also of a democracy. So what they introduced was a democratic republic. And this is why in the Constitution, in Article 4, Section 4 says, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. Now, what is a republican form of government? A republican form of government is based on laws. So you establish laws, and it is those laws that govern the government. And they made it difficult to change those laws. So, for example, the Constitution to be changed, to change this document called the Constitution, and this is why it's been in effect for that long. All this time, they have not changed, they have not removed the Constitution. There's changes, yes, but it has not been removed. And they designed a system that you have to have a real large majority to be able to make those changes. And so this was guaranteed in there. In Article 6 of the Constitution, they were also quite concerned. This was something unique. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. So there was to be no religious test. So that means that there was not going to be a church dictating to the government what is going to happen. That was another very important principle that you find in the Constitution of the United States. In the First Amendment, and amendments are changes to the Constitution. After they finished the Constitution, before the states would ratify it, they determined that there were some amendments already before they even started. And the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now keep in mind, this was something unique. This is something that was unheard of at that time. Keep in mind that in England, when the English separated from the Catholic Church, they established the Church of England, and they took control just like the Catholics did before. And when the Protestants had power in England, they persecuted the Catholics to such an extent that at one stage the Catholics had to flee England. They had, especially after Queen Mary. Queen Mary was their queen. She was persecuting the Protestants. When she died, the Protestants began persecuting the Catholics. And so what did they do? Where did they go? Where could they go? Where could the British go when they were being persecuted in their own country? Guess where they went? They went to the United States. Well, to the Americas. And they established a state in honor of their queen, in Queen Mary, and therefore you have the state of Maryland in honor of Queen Mary. So even there, but what happened when the Pilgrim Fathers, when they fled persecution in England, they went to Massachusetts. And what happened in Massachusetts? They established laws to persecute everybody else. So the persecuted became the persecutors. And so, understanding that system, these people who were establishing this Constitution determined that there would be no law to govern the establishment of religion. And so these guaranteed civil and religious liberties, entire and perpetual separation of church and state. And this is why you find this lamb-like horns, and the two things that were guiding it was the republicanism and Protestant principles. They gave religious and civil liberties in that area. So now they were truly a nation. The 13 colonies were truly a nation. And so that was on, what was it? That was on April, was it 4th? March 4th, sorry. March 4th, 1789. 1789, and in 1798 there's supposed to be a nation coming up. So 9 years later, 9 years after the government was actually established, you find the statement there that they are now in 1798 supposed to be coming up. And truly, it fits that characteristic. This was a nation coming up, completely different than any other kingdom. It was definitely lamb-like. They had fled from royal oppression, priestly intolerance, and they determined to establish a government upon the broad foundation of civil and religious liberties. No king and no pope, that's right. And so, the Declaration of Independence. Look at this statement here in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. These are truths that are self-evident. That all men are created equal. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Even though they could not understand this for a while, but when you look at the debates that took place, especially when you look at the experience with Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War that ended up the freeing of slavery, they kept referring back to this statement. These are inalienable rights. These are self-evident that all men are created equal. These are our rights. These are not our privileges. These are our rights. And the Constitution guarantees the people the right of self-government. These are very important principles that you look at as far as a nation. And today, some of these things we look at as normal in society, it's expected. But you need to understand that never had happened before. Freedom of religious faith was also granted, every man being permitted to worship God according to the dictates of his conscience. Therefore, republicanism and Protestantism became the fundamental principle of that nation. These principles are the secret of its power and its prosperity. Secret of its power and prosperity was the fundamental principles of civil and religious liberty. And as a result, from all around the world, people began to flock to the United States, including my family. My dad said that when he met that guy on that ship, he said, "You are not going to persecute me or my family ever again because we're going to America." Those were important principles. And understand, when people are oppressed, that's what they look to. And that's why the borders were open to all these people to flock to America at that time. Now, some of these privileges were given to other people, but I notice in a lot of places they are not rights, they are privileges. Even a simple thing, to build a house. You know, in the United States, it is my right to build my own house. It's not a privilege, it is my right. That means I can build, I can do my electrical work, I can do my plumbing, I can do the whole lot. And I came here in Australia and they said, "Says who?" You can't do that. You're not an electrician, you can't do your electrical work. So, but excuse me, it's my right. Well, you know, it's not my right, okay? It's your privilege to do certain things. And those privileges can just as easily be taken away. There's a difference between rights and the difference with privileges. Now, this government, it shows in Revelation 13:14, and this is so unique because, again, nations were ruled by kings. People could not think of a nation existing without a king. In the time that the United States was coming into existence, they guaranteed that it would fall apart because you have to have a king. You have to have someone ruling over you. But in Revelation 13, verse 14, it says, "And the seed then that dwell on the earth," this is, again, obviously in context here is the territory of the United States, "by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying," listen carefully, "to them that dwell on the earth," again, this is the territory there, "that they should make an image to the beast which had the wound by the sword and did live." This means that the people who live are going to make that decision. That's why you're looking at a government that is not dependent on the king. It's a government dependent upon the voice of the people. That's why it has to be a government not run by a king, but a government that has its sole existence by the decision of the people where they live. They are to make those laws. And this is why the power is in the legislative branch of government. It is the people who make those legislation. Now, this is a beast, a lamb-like beast. It became its fundamental principles were liberty. It's a freedom of religion, freedom of conscience. And at the very beginning, this nation was to be like a lamb. And then, obviously, when you think of a lamb, you don't think of war or bloodshed or turmoil. But what it says, something different. It is the way it treated its citizen was more lamb-like. And yet, as you look at this verse, he exercised all the power of the first beast before him. and caused the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. He exercises all the power of the first beast. Now, what did the first beast do? In verse 7, this is in the same chapter, we're dealing with the second beast. The first beast, it says, and it was given unto him to do what? To make war with the saints. What does that mean? That means persecution. That they made war by persecuting people, even to the point of death. And so if it says, if the first beast made war with the saints and overcame them, if it says that, then if it says in verse 12, he exercised all the power of the first beast, then it means that this the beast with lamb-like horns is also going to make war with the saints and overcome them. That's what's going to happen. And you're taking a look right now, the conflict that is going on in America, for the soul of America, you can see this taking place. In the news every day, you can see certain things encroaching upon religious freedoms that we have. And to the extent, verse 15, and he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. That means that there is going to be in America, so up until now, this is unheard of. You don't think that somebody's going to be killed for their religious convictions. But here it says that the saints who refuse to worship the image of the beast will be killed. There is going to be executions for their religious faith. Now, there was persecution already in time past in different ways, but it was quite limited. It was never to the point of death. Well, there was at one stage, but I'm talking about when the United States became a nation. This was protected. So again, when it says that a nation speaks, we are talking about the way they speak through their legality of things. And that's why it's the legislative and the judicial branch of government. It's Congress and the U.S. Supreme Court. This is where you are looking at how a nation, that particular nation is speaking. And Congress makes laws, and the Supreme Court, it's not supposed to make laws, but sometimes it does. Just recently, they throughout the United States, 5 individuals made a decision to permit gay marriage all across the United States. 5 men in the Supreme Court made that decision. And persecution began immediate. One lady in Kentucky, she said, sorry, I'm not going to issue marriage licenses to gay people. And what happened? She got arrested. She got thrown in jail. Why? She had a religious conviction. And they said, no, you can't have that religious conviction. Why not? Let somebody else do it. Why does she have to do it? This is the thing. They're trying to enforce her to do that. So, at first, they were defenders of religious liberty, especially justice for all, and yet it begins to speak as a dragon. And this is why we need to pay close attention to these 2 branches of government. What are they doing? When we're looking at the world stage, we have to see what are they doing and how liberties are being taken away. It foretells a development of the spirit of intolerance and the persecution that was manifested by the nations represented by the dragon and the leopard-like beast. That's what it's looking at. So that's why it's important to look at that characteristic. Intolerance is fast coming into the United States. Unfortunately, the intolerance is coming as a reaction to things. Just recently, when a person came into a church and he killed a whole bunch of worshipers, that is unacceptable behavior. And the knee-jerk reaction is to start taking away liberties. Even when the World Trade Center came down, the reaction is to try to protect yourself from further actions of that nature. Even the political campaign today is echoing some of those type of things. And so here, why will it persecute? Because it wants to make an image to the beast. It wants to, or as some translations put it, image of the beast. It wants to make it look like that first beast that had that original power. So, how can American people who love liberty, and even here in Australia, there's a lot of liberties that people like. Now, some liberties people are used to getting rid of, In America, you can never stop someone for a breath test. You just can't stop them unless you have reasons to believe that they might be intoxicated. You cannot just pull them over on the side of the road. Here, people just take it for granted, and one day I got stopped 2 or 3 times in one day just for a breath test, and I tell them, come on, how many times are you going to stop me? And the moment you ask them that question, pull over. You got more time now to go to the side. Okay, so, but how can people who love liberty lose their liberty so quickly? In Revelation 13, it says, and he doeth what? Great wonders, so that he maketh fire to come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men, and deceive them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by a sword and did live. People like miracles. It doesn't matter the fact that it takes away liberties. People like miracles. And Edwin Burke, as he was speaking before the House of Commons in 1784, he said, people never give up their liberties, but under some delusion. First of all, they are deluded, and then what? They are willing to give up their liberties. Benjamin Franklin, one of the founders in America, said, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. And how much of this that has been happening recently, the changes in America, the changes not only in America, because what happens in America affects the world. When in the United States they began this airport security and going through all this security, guess what? Everywhere in the world they start going through that entire thing. Every airport, it's the same thing. They're implementing the same rules as they implement in the United States. And people are willing to give up liberties in order to have safety. And what ends up happening is we lose everything. During Hitler's Germany, that's what happened at that time. Right now, I'm listening to the reading of the book. It's called The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom. And just listening to their story again, I heard it years ago, and they're reading it on BBN there. So listening to that story of how people lost their liberties, little by little, it all became, and they were thinking it's for a good cause. And they were really believing it was for a good cause, and next thing you know, you have lost your liberties. This is why it's important for us to understand what liberty really is for ourselves personally. And that liberty begins by making sure that we are free in our soul with Jesus Christ. There was a family that was visiting New York City. They were doing some sightseeing in New York City for the first time, and many places they went, and among the places was on the island there, you have the Statue of Liberty there in the island of Ellis Island. They had closed Ellis Island just before I entered New York, so we did not stop there at that Liberty Island there. And after the exciting first day, the little girl found it difficult to get to sleep. She was having a hard time sleeping, and the father said, "Why aren't you going to sleep?" And she says, "Daddy, I'm thinking about that lady with a lamp out there in the dark. She's all alone. Don't you think we should be helping Miss Liberty to hold up the lamp?" It's coming from a child, but that's a very important principle. To help hold up the torch of liberty is the duty not only of one family, but of every true Christian throughout America and the world. It's important to understand what liberty is all about. And some people are willing to die just to get liberty. And I think of my father, who was willing to leave everything that he knew behind, all the comforts, everything that he knew as it was, to go out on his voyage on a ship to take his family across to a strange place because he heard about liberty. And the question is, are you free in your own soul? Because you see, we want to go to a place that has liberty. And genuine liberty you find in keeping the law of God. You find genuine liberty in worshiping our Creator. And this is why tomorrow we're going to be talking about worship. Are you worshiping? Are you experiencing genuine liberty in your life experience so that we can get ready to spend eternity with our Savior? Amen.